The issue I'm raising today comes out of what's set down as the Old Testament reading for this Sunday. And it's the issue of, do we really trust God's promises? And I'm sure most of us would say, well, yes, of course we do. He's God. His promises are always true. But would we trust to the point of believing so that we actually act on them? We aren't always quite so sure about that. It's when we're pushed to the limit that we know that we really do believe or don't believe in God's promises. And to illustrate this, I'm going to look at the patriarch Abraham. In Genesis chapter 12, we read, God told Abraham to leave where he was living and take all his family and all his belongings and go to a land where he would show him. And so Abraham left Haran, where he was and headed down into what's now Israel. When he got there, God said to him that his descendants would be a great nation. Now at that stage, Abraham was already pretty old, we think 75, and Sarah probably about 65, and they were childless. Sometime later, we read how Abraham was complaining to God and saying he had no descendants and it would be a slave who inherited all his goods. And God said, no, you will have a son and he will be your heir. By this time we think Abraham's 85. And it says Abraham believed him, and God counted this to Abraham as righteousness because he had believed God's promise. But he still had no child, and they were getting older and older. And this is where Abraham and Sarah, despite believing God's promise, thought they would have to take things into their own hands. And so Sarah said to Abraham to take her slave girl Hagar and sleep with her, which he did. And he had a son by her, and they called this son Ishmael. So Abraham had believed what God had said, but not to the point where he thought, well, it's going to happen without my intervention. Felt he had to intervene and make it happen. When he reached the age of 99, God spoke to him again and said, Sarah will bear you a son. So we think Sarah by that stage was 89. Abraham laughed. It simply wasn't possible. Then he had 3 men come and visit him, visitors from God, and they said to him that Sarah would bear a son. And this time Sarah was in the tent behind and she heard it and she laughed because it was just so impossible. And yet it was exactly as God said. The 3 men had said in a year's time Sarah would have a son. And exactly what happened. In a year's time, she bore a son and they called him Isaac. And so God's promise became true, despite the fact that Abraham and Sarah had both doubted it was possible. Now, sometime later in the chapter 22 of Genesis, we read how God put Abraham to the test. God asked Abraham to go to a place that he would show him, and Abraham was to make a sacrifice. But sacrifice was to be his son Isaac. Now at that time this was actually quite a common practice amongst the tribes around them, that people would sacrifice their children to the gods. And so Abraham set out in obedience. Isaac was old enough to know what they were going to do. They were going to make a sacrifice. And he said to his dad, well, we've got the wood for the sacrifice, we've got the fire, but what about the lamb to sacrifice? And Abraham's response was, God will provide the lamb. Isaac was the only son, and he'd been born to them so late in life. He was the only hope of their having descendants. And God's saying, I want you to sacrifice him. To go through this would have been absolutely horrendous for Abraham. Just imagine being asked to do that. It would seem like God's making a mockery of the promise that he'd made. Knowing full well what God had asked him to do, he was still able to say to Isaac, it's okay, God will provide. And so they went out into the wilderness. Where was a lamb going to be? Out there. This time Abraham did not try to take things into his own hands. He didn't go looking for the lamb. In fact, he bound Isaac and raised his knife ready to kill him. And that's when God said, no, don't. He'd gone the whole way, and it was only when God stopped him that he saw that there was a lamb caught in the thorn bushes. Abraham named the place God will provide. In Hebrew it's Moriah, and Mount Moriah is now in the temple area in Jerusalem. Abraham's trust in the promise of God was tested to its absolute utmost limit. But God said to him, and this is verse 12, "Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." And a bit further on he says, this is verse 16, "Because you have done this and not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." Now, would we have had the same trust in God's promise that Abraham did? It's easy to say that we trust his promises. It's not so easy to act on them when all seems impossible. But it was because of Abraham's complete trust and obedience, God was able to do mighty things through him. I wonder if he would be able to do mighty things through us because of our trust and obedience.
From the break of the dawn to the setting of the sun, I will stand on every promise of your word. Words of power, strong to say, that will never pass away. I will stand on every promise of your word. For your covenant is sure, and on this I am secure. I can stand on every promise of your word. When I stumble and I see condemnation resting, I will stand on every promise of your word. You are faithful to forgive, that in freedom I might live. So I stand on every promise of your word. If your innocence restored, you remember sin no more. So I'll stand on every promise of your word. When I'm faced with anguish choice, I will listen for your voice, and I'll stand on every promise of your word. Through this dark and cold land, you will guide me with your hand, as I stand on every promise of your word. And you promise to complete every work begun in me, so I'll stand on every promise of your word. Hope that lives from despair, love that casts out every fear, as I stand on every promise of your word. Not forsaken, not alone, for the Comforter has come, and I stand on every promise of your word. Grace sufficient, grace for me, grace for all who will believe. We will stand on every promise of your word. Grace sufficient, grace for me, grace for all who will believe. We will stand